Thanks, Kenneth. Much appreciated. So my name's Dale Carlson, and I am indeed the author of Kahn's Detroit, a field guide to Albert Kahn designs of the metro area, and I've been invited to lecture to you tonight for just under an hour on the subject of Albert Kahn. And tonight what I'm going to talk about is adaptive reuses and remodels of Albert Kahn structures in the Detroit area that imparted a certain degree of unintended consequences in that they affected cultures that popped up, subcultures that popped up after Kahn's lifetime. And the title of my lecture is Albert Kahn, Unintended Consequences. I published my book in January of 2022. Second edition will probably come out in the coming years that adds a few more things I've discovered since then and maybe a couple corrections, unfortunately. Actually, there's only one correction I need to make so far, and that's pretty good when you're writing a book about 300 commissions, in my opinion. Before I get started on the lecture, I want to thank the Livonia Public Library for inviting me to present. Kenneth Bignati especially, because he put together most of the work to make this program happen, and also Nathan there, who's handling a lot of the technical angles and is going to help us get this posted publicly later in the year. So I'm going to break down tonight's lecture into 5 segments. I'll start out with a really short bio myself and how this book came about and how I attained my expertise as an architectural historian. We'll have a bio of Albert Kahn that helps you learn more about how he rose to prominence as an internationally influential architect, working primarily in the Detroit area, but really designing stuff that's being built all over the world. We'll consider 2 types of influence that an architect is able to exert on the world around them. And then we'll look at our countdown of these adaptive renovations I've compiled for the purposes of this lecture. We'll finish it off with a Q&A. So let's talk about myself first. My interest in architectural history in the state of Michigan and the city of Detroit starts in the early 1990s when I leave my boyhood home of Traverse City to attend school at Michigan State University in East Lansing. And back then I had a lot more hair. So one of my favorite things to do back then was drive from East Lansing to Detroit pretty much every weekend for many years on end, 7 to be precise, to take in the city's exploding house and techno music scene, which were really super groundbreaking and a huge influence on me through a lot of the 1990s and the 2000s. And as a bright-eyed youngster from Traverse City, seeing constructions of this epic scale and proportion for the first time on a regular basis, it really made a big impact on me. And studying architectural history became kind of a hobby for me. And it remained a hobby for about 15 years until, through a unique set of circumstances, I was introduced to a guy by the name of Einar E. Kvaran. He's Icelandic by descent, and that accounts for his slightly uncommon first name. Einar lived in the Detroit area in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He lives in suburban Phoenix now. And Einar, over the course of a few months of correspondence, eventually revealed to me that in the 1980s, I think he said, maybe the 90s, it's in my book, that he hunted down a son of Corrado Parducci, the architectural sculptor about whom I wrote a book. And his son, Alan, allowed Einar to photocopy his original ledgers from his Detroit studio, as well as a scrapbook that contained over 700 images of sculpture that Parducci produced over a career that lasted over a half century, 1921 to 1981. Excuse me. Well, once I learned about the ledgers, the gears in my mind started clicking. And I decided I wanted to write a book about it. Parducci, he's a really well-known person in the annals of Detroit architectural history. Nobody had written a book about him yet. And I felt like these ledgers, they fell into my lap purely out of circumstance, and I felt a certain responsibility to do something really monumental with them, and that's where my first book came from. And after I published the first book, that actually took me about 7 years. There were many bumps in the road. But the process of writing it was so fulfilling, and I loved doing it so much that I immediately followed it up. In 2 years, I wrote 2 more books, and that is a field guide to stained glass in New Orleans, as well as Kahn's Detroit that we're talking about tonight. And it was over the course of writing these books, the first one more than anyone, the Parducci book, where I really learned what it takes to find the proper sources and build the proper attributions to really be able to solidly back up the claims that you make in your book about the origin of the artwork and the buildings we see inside. So that's how I acquired my expertise, and now let's move on to our subject for the evening, Albert Kahn. Hopefully most of you have heard of him, but if you haven't, I'm glad to make you more familiar tonight because he's a really important figure in Detroit's cultural and architectural history, and industrial history also, as you'll see. Kahn is born in 1869 in Raunen, Germany. This is a town that is about halfway between Frankfurt and Luxembourg, and his family lives there for approximately 6 years before they actually move into the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg in 1875. They live there for another 6 years before they immigrate to the United States in 1881. He's the eldest of 8 children, and by the time they move to the United States, about half of the children are born. At the really young age of 14, maybe 15, he gets a job with Mason and Rice. This is George D. Mason and Zachariah Rice, and they're a pretty happening, influential firm in Detroit at the time. In fact, George D. Mason, he's really important to Michigan's architectural history also. He designed the Masonic Temple in Detroit as well as the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. So Kahn is really fortunate to get into this office, and he's also very fortunate to have George D. Mason as a lifelong mentor from this point forward. And he rises up in the ranks until he becomes the chief designer in 1891. He keeps that job for approximately another half decade, at which point he starts his first partnership in 1896, Nettleton, Kahn, and Trowbridge. This is a really short-lived partnership because Trowbridge leaves the next year to head the architecture department at Cornell University. 2 years later, Nettleton dies at the very young age of 37, and Kahn is on his own again. He reunites with George D. Mason for 1 year to form the corporation Mason and Kahn, and during that time, he designs the Palms apartment building on East Jefferson, just outside downtown Detroit, as well as West Hall, sometimes known as West Engineering, on the Diag at the University of Michigan. And these are a couple of the very first designs that he creates utilizing reinforced concrete. And they're very successful. They still stand today, which is a testament to their success. And it kind of sets Kahn up as, the preeminent user of reinforced concrete designs in the metro area. So this leads to his first really big automotive manufacturing facility commission for the Packard plant in 1905, again using reinforced concrete. And the revolutionary expansion of space, especially for windows to allow in daylight, it's so impactful on the industry that Kahn is then set up as the preeminent designer of all auto manufacturing facilities in Detroit at a time when the industry is just absolutely exploding. And over the next 3 decades, he designs 3 factories that exert a massive influence on the evolution of architectural design worldwide. The most important is, without a doubt, the Ford Highland Park plant that still stands today, and because it's the earliest. But also super influential are the River Rouge plant in Dearborn and the half-ton truck plant in Warren. And these plants are designed with no attempt to disguise the interior structural engineering, which is a departure from the way it's been done in the past. And the sparse, streamlined look, it really resonates with a group of European architects known as the Modernists. The Modernists' most important member is without a doubt Walter Gropius, who goes on to found the Bauhaus School of Architecture in Weimar, Germany, which ends up being one of the most important architectural schools in the history of architecture. And we can see from his 1911 design here for the Fagus Work shoe factory in Eltville, Germany, that he is indeed attempting to emulate the look that Kahn creates with his steel sash curtain walls that are so common to the reinforced concrete factory style that he pioneers. So the Modernists, their ideas about architecture, they really start to coalesce mid-century, mid-20th century, and it kind of forms this style of epic and huge building construction known as the International style. And we have so many great examples of the international style here in Detroit because we have been a forerunner in the field of architecture for many decades. Philip Johnson, he designed the Comerica Tower, now known as the Ally Bank Tower downtown. That's later in his career. It's a little bit more historicist than international, but I bring him up because Philip Johnson, he's one of the people that coins the term international style in a book he writes in the 30s. It's co-written with a second person. I can't remember the co-author's name. But Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, they designed the Ford World Headquarters in Dearborn, a building you're probably all familiar with. This is a quintessential example of the international style, despite its obvious use of color, which is not common to the international style. Eero Saarinen, he's Finnish, but he lives in the Detroit area in the most fruitful parts of his career in Bloomfield Township. He designs the Gateway Arch in St. Louis and is designing in the international style for buildings that are built all over North America and some in Western Europe, as evidenced by this photo of his embassy in London building. So I'm really not the most qualified person to talk about this, though, the evolution from Kahn's formative years to being a huge influence on the modernists. There's a lot more serious academians than me that have done it in a way more eloquent way, and I want to tell you about them because I'm only degreed in photography. The architectural history I became a professional at just by studying it real hard in my spare time, but I'm not formally trained in structural engineering. These guys discuss this stuff in a lot more eloquent terms than I can. The first is by an Italian by the name of Federico Bucci, and he publishes this book in Italian, Albert Kahn, Architect of Ford, in 1991, and it's translated to English in 93. In 2001, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, they hold a retrospective of Kahn's life and work, and they produce a catalog that goes along with the retrospective, and it's got essays by 4 different writers who write just really super well-researched, well-reasoned explanations of exactly how Kahn's style of factory design influenced what would later become skyscrapers on skylines throughout the United States and Europe. So Kahn is unique among architects in that not only does he exert a massive influence on the evolution of architectural design, he also exerts a massive influence on the direction of world history in general, and not many architects can say that. This influence on world history is best exemplified by his plants that he designed in Ypsilanti, the Willow Run bomber plant, most of which is torn down now, but I was lucky to get these photographs in the years before they were torn down. And also the Chrysler Tank Arsenal plant in Warren. And both of these plants are built in anticipation of the United States becoming more deeply involved in World War II, which absolutely does happen. So when you hear people use the phrase arsenal of democracy to describe Detroit, these 2 factories are the most literal examples of Detroit being the arsenal of democracy. The bomber plant produces B-24 Liberator aircraft, and the tank plant produces Grant and Sherman tanks, and they produce a lot of them. Detroit only has 2% of the nation's population at this point, but they produce about 10% of the munitions the United States uses during World War II, which is a phenomenal contribution. So this gives us a chance to compare the 2 major types of influence an architect can exert. Obviously, there's the effect upon the evolution of architectural design, but there's also the effect upon culture and history, best exemplified by the 2 latter factories I just mentioned. And for tonight's lecture, we're going to be a little bit more concerned about the effect on culture and history than we are on the evolution of architectural design, although we'll touch on it just a little bit. So when we consider the degree of unintended consequences that is imparted by an adaptive renovation or reuse of an Albert Kahn building, we're going to ask ourselves 2 questions. First, how unpredictable is the reuse or the remodel? Would Albert Kahn have been able to anticipate this happening in his lifetime? And also, more importantly, does the adaptive reuse or renovation intersect with an influential cultural, political, or art movement that develops after Kahn dies? And this is where we find our greatest degree of unintended consequences, and I think you'll be very shocked and surprised to see what kind of subcultures Albert Kahn might have imparted an influence upon. So let's go to the countdown now, and we're going to start in the Soviet Union, and this will be our only entry in the lecture that is not in the Detroit area. From 1929 to 1932, Kahn's offices send 25 architects and engineers to the Soviet Union. They educate thousands of Soviets in the art of designing and building large factories. Excuse me. And with the help of Kahn, the Soviet government constructs over 500 plants that are designed by Kahn. So this is just an example of how epic these plants are. I don't like to try to pronounce this word up here on the top, but we can see that they're in Stalingrad and Chelyabinsk, and this is just a fraction. The purpose of these plants is to bring Russia out of their agrarian economy and into a more Americanized industrial kind of culture. But as the storm clouds of war gather in Europe in the mid-30s, it comes as very little surprise to the architects nor to the US government, in my opinion, that the Soviets decide to transform a lot of these plants into wartime production, and they begin producing tanks. And for those of you who don't know, the Soviet contribution in terms of human life to the World War II effort against the Nazis dwarfs any other nation by a landslide. They give up 10 million soldiers to military conflict, and another 10 million civilians are killed. During the war, they lose a total of over 20 million, and that's 15% of their nation's population. No other nation comes even close. The United States, by comparison, loses about 500,000 lives to World War II. So, in my mind, there's no question that without the Soviet contribution, the Nazi regime is never fully vanquished in Europe, and that's where Albert Kahn's influence comes in. He's producing tanks that are fighting on both sides of the front, or at least tanks are being produced at the plants he designs on both sides of the front. And without the Soviets, I would say that eastern parts of Europe would probably still have major Nazi influence happening to this day, in my personal opinion. The Russian contribution, it's acknowledged in the press very regularly towards the end of the war. This is just approaching VE Day, and we can see that they're a huge, huge part of the Allied effort. And for this reason, I like to say that these adaptive renovations applied to these plants, they're the most important of any adaptive renovations that have ever been applied to any Albert Kahn structures anywhere. The degree of unintended consequences, though, it's actually not that high because Kahn's company anticipated this happening. They talk about it in some of their discussions in the years when they're building it, and Kahn saw it happen in his lifetime, so it's not super surprising. So we only give it, let's say a 3, maybe a 4 on the unintended consequences scale. It's not scientific, it's just for fun. If anybody takes issue with my rating, we'll talk about it in the Q&A. So let's move into your area now. I added 3 structures in your area to this lecture. I'd like to do that specifically for the community I'm lecturing for. This is Phoenix Mill at Northville Road. You may have not seen it from this side because this is down in the parking lot area that was closed off for a few years while they were renovating it recently. This is how it appears from the front when you drive by it on the road. And I took these pictures during their remodeling and renovating a few years ago. The sale process and the new business taking over it got hampered by the pandemic a bit. So it took a second, but this is now, let me talk just a little bit about the history first. This was part of Ford's Village Industries. Are people aware of the Village Industries and how Ford had small factories in outlying suburban towns that would all do one small task in the otherwise larger production of an automobile? Okay, it sounds like some people are familiar with it. Well, this was a Village Industries plant, and it's also one of the plants that kind of helped build the Rosie the Riveter image that was so popular coming out of World War II, because during World War II, you can see there's a lot of women that are working here because the men, they're overseas fighting. So that's a really interesting part of the history. The Henry Ford Museum's photo collection is very easily accessible online, so you can find a lot of historical images related to this plant there, and some others you'll see in a second. And this is now an events place where you can have like a graduation party or a bar mitzvah or a wedding reception. And it's just gotten started recently. I can't speak to their success. I haven't talked to anybody about how they feel about the renovation, but it's definitely different, and it's definitely a completely different than its intended usage as a factory. So the unintended consequences here, again, kind of high, not super high, maybe a 3 or a 4. In downtown Northville, you'll find the Ford Motor Company valve plant. This is built in 1936. And if you hang out in downtown Northville at all, you probably know that there's a few different businesses happening in here that are no longer a valve plant. This plant, for some reason, it gets into AP's wire and it gets publicized all over the United States at the time it's constructed in 1936. Ends up in 5 Alabama newspapers, which I found really curious. But yeah, you go looking for information about this one in a digital news archive, you're going to find a ton. It's all the same article, just repeated over and over, though, which is the way the AP does it with their nationally distributed pieces. Some more Henry Ford Museum historical photos. I maybe should have brightened these a little bit, but to my best of my knowledge, this is the only building I know of that Kahn designed that had this kind of water wheel attached to it, and I believe that did actually generate power at one time. It does not anymore, but I believe they got the wheel working again. So here's a few businesses that occupy it at this point. Spark and Amity, they're like prefab workspaces where your office is at capacity and you need more workers, you can hire out space that they arrange for you. Planet Fitness is a workout club. HKS is actually an architectural firm, and that's really, in my opinion, apropos to have them there inside this building. But none of them are close to the original intent, which is valve production. So again, we'll give this about a 4 on the unintended consequences scale. These photos from Amity, I think, are the most dramatic representation of how an interior space like this can be dramatically changed to be appropriate for a non-industrial setting. Really great work that they appear to have done here. I have never stepped inside, though. The last one we're going to cover in your area is the Burroughs Adding Machine Company offices and plant on Plymouth Road. This is a really late era Kahn, and in my opinion, this is a design where the senior architect in Kahn's office was given a lot of leeway, because at Kahn, he's a neoclassicist for most of his career, and he doesn't allow his architects to make super modern buildings until about the mid-30s. And we can see almost all the neoclassical design has fallen away here. It's very modern looking, even by today's standards. And we're fortunate that this building still stands, and like the others before it, it has been transformed into a mixed-use facility with lots of different kinds of businesses, only 2 of which are even remotely related to its original, I'm not sure what Burroughs produced here, but it's an adding machine company, so it's slightly industrial like that, but they don't really have an assembly line running through the factory floor, I would bet. Again, I haven't stepped inside those places, but a really interesting mix of businesses that continue this building's useful life, which is what we really like to see. And I'll give this a 4 on the unintended consequences scale also. And I just threw in a picture of the powerhouse because it's still being used, but I can't say what for. If somebody in the audience knows, I want you to tell me during the Q&A. Unfortunately, a lot of you probably remember the old Burroughs smokestack that was on this guy. And I don't know what year it got removed, but I thought it was an awesome feature to this building that I wish was still there. So let's move on now into the city of Detroit, where the rest of our commissions will be. And we're first going to look at a group of 5 corner banks. And corner banks are among the most common kinds of structures in the city of Detroit to be adaptively renovated for 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and even 5th uses. And we have a little bit of a variety here. This one right here is a check cashing place, and that's almost its original use as a financial institution. So that gets a 2 on the unintended consequences scale. Churches are really common. If you drive around the city of Detroit, you'll find 30 or 40 churches, not all Delbert Kahn designs, but all kinds of different designs that have been transformed from a bank into a church. So those are pretty low on the scale too. We'll give those a 3 on the unintended consequences scale. Here, these guys actually moved to a different location, but they used this as discount beauty supply for years. JD's Mart on Hamilton. It was a convenience store for many years. That's one of my favorite Albert Kahn bank designs there, but the paint job isn't really helping it much. So that's pretty common too, and we'll give those also a 3 on the unintended consequences scale. A little bit more interesting example, though, is the Moorish Science Temple of America number 25 at 5601 Grand River. And the Moorish Science Temple of America is an American Islamic sect, which is even less common than a Middle Eastern Islamic sect living in the United States. So that's kind of a weird usage there and not something you see very often. We're going to give them a 4. The most interesting example, though, in my opinion, this is the exact same design as JD's Mart I just talked about a second ago. This is a New Life Prosthetics and Orthotics at the corner of Milwaukee and Woodward, right near the New Center part of town. And this has been run as a prosthetics and orthotics lab for over a decade now. And the owners are the people that also managed the adaptive renovation. They've shown me around the place, and I lifted just a few pictures from the internet to show you what kind of work goes on here, which is a huge departure from banking. So I rate this even higher on the scale of unintended consequences, and I give it a 5. This is one of my favorite examples in the whole lecture, and in some later versions of the lecture, I might raise this higher up in the list, because the more I talk about this building, the more I find its story fascinating. This is the Standard Auto Corporation Auto Company garage and showroom at 4454 Woodward, built in 1907 for the Standard Auto Company. And it stays in their hands for about 10 years, at which point it is taken over by an auto dealer by the name of Thomas J. Doyle. Thomas J. Doyle, he's a pretty successful guy. He's got a satellite branch on East Jefferson, closer to Indian Village. But if you live in Midtown and you want to buy a Dodge from Thomas J. Doyle, you're probably going to go to his Midtown location. And I theorize that is most likely the case when Ty Cobb purchases a car from him in 1916. Ty Cobb is mostly a Midtown guy. Throughout his years in Detroit, he had 4 or 5 different addresses. Every one of them's in Midtown. So chances are he bought at this shop, maybe a 5% chance he went out by Indian Village. If we look at his American League batting averages here from 1907 to 1919, we see he leads the league every year except for 1916, begging the obvious question, should he have bought a Ford? Doyle hangs on to the dealership until about 1923, at which point it's taken over by Aaron DeRoy. DeRoy is a very prominent citizen in the Hebrew community of Detroit and Detroit in general. And he makes his money as an auto dealer, and he hangs on to this dealership until 1935, right around the time he passes away, at which point a really long line of inhabitants takes over, and this lasts from the 30s to the 90s. And of the inhabitants of this building during that time, the Yale and Town Manufacturing Company is without a doubt the most important. They add a partner in 65, and they end up being there for approximately 14 years. But it's not just that they had the longest tenancy. It's also that when they take possession of the building in 1955, they publish a drawing. And the drawing shows that it is nearly the exact same proportion and scale as the original Standard Auto Company building. And this rules out the possibility that a rebuild has taken place at this site. Also in 62, they detail another adaptive renovation, so that's 2 they've applied to this building. We can bet Doyle did one too, but that's not the end of the story just yet. The building, it kind of fades out of the public record, and I don't find much newspaper of it. It's from like the 1990s to the early 2000s. And in 2006, 2007, it reemerges as the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit. And this is what makes it so interesting. Most Kahn buildings that have been transformed for museum-type usage, they show off something that is specific to what the building originally did. The PACKARD Proving Grounds in Shelby Township, they have a car museum. You know, the Rouge plant tour, it's about cars. This is fine art, so that's a huge departure from its original intent, and for that reason, we give it a 6 on the unintended consequences scale. So this last adaptive renovation is managed by a guy that has some local connections. His name is Andrew Zago. He gets a bachelor's in fine arts from Michigan, and he goes on to get a master's in architecture from Harvard. And his local connections are tight enough that in 1999, he's given a lot of space in the Free Press to discuss a really great plan he has for adaptive reuse of Tiger Stadium. That unfortunately never comes to fruition. Over the course of multiple adaptive renovations, the front of this building's appearance has changed dramatically. But over those renovations, the original masonry arrangement of the north main entrance remains the same, and for that reason, we thank the adaptive renovators. We're going to move on to a portion of my lecture now that I call They Did What? And this is about buildings that have been marred by aesthetically challenged renovations. And we are going to start off with the United Savings Bank in downtown Detroit in the Capitol Park neighborhood. And here we have its beautiful original neoclassical appearance in the 1920s. But as we move into the 1960s, employers are having a hard time with daydreaming and staring out the window on behalf of their employees. Daniels and Zermatt has a solution to your problem, and also your window washing costs. And they trade in this beautiful neoclassical facade for this flat marble, and the Free Press very generously refers to it as a facelift, when, in my opinion, most people who see it in the present day and age think of it as a face punch. Just my personal opinion. We have another really sad example here right at the corner of Grand Boulevard in Woodward. This building served as the Detroit Central Police Station for many years. In the 1960s, its original appearance was covered up with these awful bands of stucco-esque, I'm not sure what I'd call the material here. I would say that I don't like it though, because this is how it originally appeared. And if we do some deep digging, we'll find out that there was a reason. The terracotta on the original sheathing, it was going bad. And you know, at this point in American history, expense is starting to become a much bigger factor in how nice do we want this building to be. In my opinion, they probably refaced it in the stucco-esque type stuff because replacing terracotta was cost prohibitive. Just my theory, though. I don't have anything to prove that. So the last one I want to talk about is the Security Trust Building. This is right across from the hot dog places everybody loves on Lafayette. And it's covered in Parducci sculpture, and probably some of it's by his masters from New York, too, because Kahn hired those guys together a lot back then. And in 1965, they decide they want to add a couple stories to it. Ouch. Really don't like this, and guess who doesn't either? Parducci. He is quoted in an interview as saying, the building has been ruined by the addition, and when you compare them side by side, you cannot argue with Parducci's conclusion, and he loses a little bit of his sculpture in the process, and I just absolutely hate this addition here. The architects are never credited in the paper, and I can't help but wonder if that's on purpose. So these renovations, they give us a chance to think about what might Kahn have thought about this era of renovation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when neoclassical facades were regularly getting covered up by aluminum, or the alterations to the building are so unsympathetic that it's a catastrophe. And my opinion is that he would hate it, and he'd have a very low opinion of it, and for that reason I rate the unintended consequences very high, and I give it a 7 on the 10 scale, but that's a -7. So let's keep that in mind. One other really interesting adaptive reuse that I have to bring up is when Burger Chef moved into this building in 1980. And right around the corner, there's another building with Parducci sculpture all over it. That's called the Bankers Trust Company. It gets a McDonald's. I don't know how long they last in these locations, but fast food as we know it, it's not invented in Kahn's lifetime. It's actually like 4 or 5 years after his lifetime where they first have the first real McDonald's in America. And for that reason, again, the degree of unintended consequences is super high, and I give this an 8 on the 10 scale. So the last example that I'm going to talk about in the They Did What section is the least egregious. And I personally don't like it when arches get filled in. This was originally an open-air construction. But if it has to be done, this is about as graceful as it can be done. And there's a reason that it's more graceful than the other remodelings you've seen here, and that's because it is executed by a guy by the name of Eliel Saarinen. And this is the father, this is the son of Eero. Actually, I get them screwed up sometime, and I can't remember who's the father or the son. They're both Finnish, and their careers overlap. But they are making some really progressive stuff at the beginning of the era where architectural ornaments beginning to fall away, but it hasn't completely. So you can see that it's more streamlined than the generations that precede them, but it's not quite the total glass and steel look that starts to dominate in the 1970s. Anyway, super, super respected father and son architectural team, and that is why this building that has filled-in arches looks significantly better than most buildings that have filled-in arches. Here's some original looks at how it looked in its early years. This was an open-air gathering place that they would use when there was public events at the open-air Greek theater nearby. At intermissions, people would have refreshments and discussion here. And this is this is the first of the drawings that Albert Kahn Associates allow me to use in my lectures, so I like to thank them every time I show an original drawing. There'll be, I think, 1 or 2 more tonight. And this one you can find online in the CRANBROOK archives if you go digging deep enough. You don't have to really dig that deep, but great examples of its original appearance. So the obvious reason that they filled them in my opinion, it's just a theory, not proven, but they wanted a year-round building. It's not too hard to figure that one out. And why might they want a year-round building? Well, so they can have Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier come to town and lecture inside the building in months where it normally wouldn't be used. And these are both modernists that are influenced by Kahn in his early years. Le Corbusier to a greater extent than Frank Lloyd Wright, but he is influenced by Kahn to a certain degree nonetheless. So that's the last of those adaptive renovations. Let's talk about a really super interesting one that is pertinent to both the city of Detroit and my neck of the woods, Oakland County. I live in Berkeley. This is the New Center building that you find in the New Center area of Detroit, just a few blocks north of the Fisher building. And when it opens in 1932, one moment, Albert Kahn Corporation moves in, and this is where their head offices are till about 2017, 2018, at which point they move to the Fisher building. So Albert Kahn's office is in this building, and in the 1970s and 80s, a program was put together to transplant the interior decoration and Albert Kahn's personal library from this building to the main library at Lawrence Tech University in Southfield. So you can walk right into the office as it mostly appeared to Kahn in the time that, you know, he was doing a lot of his work here. And it's just a fascinating repurposing and remodeling. Take close attention to the door there and the octagonal window. This is just a snippet of an original architectural drawing, but it's enough to show that this indeed is his office transplanted. And a lot of people are most captivated by the interior decoration. It is beautiful, I agree. I love it. But to me, the coolest thing about this library is that Albert Kahn's personal library has been transplanted here. And if you go here and you start sticking your nose into Albert Kahn's library, you really get an awesome sense of how he drew on so many classical influences when he was designing his own buildings. Because in the early years, they almost always, the big commercial ones, have neoclassical elements that come from the old country. If you go in there and you tell them you're a big Albert Kahn fan and you would like to see it, almost always they will go back there with somebody and unlock it and let you look around. If you form a closer relationship with them and stop regularly, they will grow to trust you, and sometimes they will let you hang out in there on your own, which is really, really great. So let's move to Highland Park now. This is a Highland Park State Bank branch that's built approximately 1920. If you drive around in the city a lot, you've undoubtedly driven by this because it's right at the corner of 6 Mile and Woodward, but its appearance has changed so much that you might not recognize it anymore. In fact, you definitely wouldn't. Let's talk about its history. Of course, it serves as the bank office for a lot of the 1920s, but it's big enough that it has some other private offices inside, and we can see that there are some general contractors working out of it in 35, some home sellers in 37. There's a creamery that experiences some petty crime in 44. That's probably an ice cream shop, but it's more fashionable to call them a creamery back then. We've got some home sales, some insurance sales. And then in 1972, we see that it starts to be used as an adult movie theater, a usage that it continues into the 90s. And at this point, we're very fortunate to have a somewhat notable photographer by the name of Camilo Jose Vergara, who's from out of town. I believe he's South American. I'm not sure what nationality. And Vergara, he likes to come to old American industrial cities and document what happens over the years on the corners. And he has donated a large portion of his archive to the Library of Congress. You can very easily find these photos online. So we see what happens here to the Highland State Bank from 93 to 2002. 2002, it loses almost all of its character. 2008, it does lose all its character, and it's sheathed in this awful pink and white stucco-ish. And you can't even tell that it might have been an Albert Kahn design at one time. And it continues that usage until this day, although it has changed its corporate name. I took this photograph just a couple summers ago. And because of the somewhat taboo nature of the commerce that takes place in this building and the fact that this aspect of American culture is way less developed in Kahn's lifetime, this is a super high degree of unintended consequences, and we give it a 9 on the 10 scale. Let's now move on to the Union Drawn Steel Company plant. This is in the Rivertown Warehouse District of Detroit at 237 Josh Compound. This was not commonly known as an Albert Kahn design in the years before I did my book, but now everybody knows it is. But I was really pleased to present it as such over the last few years because not many people knew about it. I was able to prove it's an Albert Kahn design by hunting down original drawings in the Albert Kahn Associates archives. And I thank them again for allowing me to use their drawings when I present. There are other pieces of information, though, that do indeed prove this is a Albert Kahn design facility. We have a notification in the Free Press in 1916 about the Albert Kahn design. There's an automotive industry periodical in 1920 that shows that this company does indeed have a branch facility in Detroit. And we also get the street address in Polk's Detroit City Directory, 1922, 1923. Let's just talk just a little bit about its history after Union Drawn Steel quit producing here. There's a few different light industrial outfits that work out of this location. Republic Steel Corporation, Warner Swasey, Stroh Industries, but they're not related to the brewer. It's a separate company that has quite a few small plants in Detroit at the time. And then in 1987, we see it's on sale again. And Steve Campbell, our agent, wants us to know that it's ideal for conversion to uses other than industrial. And Steve Campbell knows of which he speaks, for this has been the Atwater Brewery since 1997. And I was allowed to take a look around the facilities in preparing this lecture about a year back. So I thank the general manager, Chris Owens, for granting me that access. We can see a really great example of its former heavy industrial use in this overhead crane here, this red bar here. It used to go back and forth the whole length of the building, but it's immobilized now. So just evidence of its former use. I also got to take a look inside the offices, but I was not able to find any drawings for the interior. So I can't give you a 100% guarantee that this is original, but it is very representative of what we would expect to see in the offices of a plant in the 1920s. So I personally believe it's original. The owners of the Atwater Brewery, they started brewing here because they respected the Stroh brewing tradition that had started right in that part of town. So transforming an industrial space into a brewery in and of itself, it doesn't warrant being number 3 on my list. But what makes this adaptive renovation and reuse really interesting to me is the fact that it coincides in the mid to late 90s with a just huge explosion of American microbreweries. And this is an ethos of brewing that is completely at odds with the ethos that dominates in Kahn's time, which is try to increase your market share at every turn. These people are brewing small batches on purpose and not really making a concerted effort to get bigger. They're also incorporating Detroit history themes and Michigan flavors, which is another development in the industry that I don't think Kahn would have been able to anticipate and would probably be a little bit fascinated by. And for that reason, I'll give the degree of unintended consequences 7 on the 10 scale. We're now to my final 2 entries, folks, and these really are the main reasons I wrote this lecture, because I was so fascinated with how deep Albert Kahn's influence runs in the metro area. So this is the Murray Corporation body plant, and if you ever take 75 North from downtown after an event maybe, you can't miss them. They're absolutely mammoth buildings. that you pass right after you get past Grand Boulevard. And the Murray, let me talk about the campus first. A common misconception about this campus is that every building there is a Kahn design, and that is not the case. Only these two highlighted in white are Kahn designs. So that has led to some confusion over the years, as we're going to find out in a moment. We use Sanborn insurance maps frequently to discover building dates at a big site like this that has multiple buildings, and they're an invaluable tool to architectural historians throughout the world, actually. Mostly in the United States, though. Murray Body Corporation's run in Detroit ends in 1955, at which point there's a bank auction that clears out the interior tools, and it lays vacant for a few years before it's reborn in 1960 as the Russell Industrial Center, a name that it still keeps today. And in the early years, the owners of the Russell Industrial Center, they like to brag about how many people, how many companies they have running concurrently at this site. And the highest number I ever hunted down was 71. And a lot of these businesses in the early years are connected to paper publishing and that kind of paper distributorship, binderies, that kind of industry. But as we move forward in history into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it becomes more of a space for local artisans to rent studio space to make their creations. And one really awesome example I found over the course of my research was this clothing company from Detroit called Ghetto Rags that in the 90s was pretty popular, and they tried to capitalize on Detroit's tough image. And there's no guarantee that they were creating in a Kahn design building, but they were definitely creating inside a building at a site dominated by Kahn buildings. So probably in a Kahn building, but maybe not. But what's really fascinating to me about this reuse is this guy right here, Mark Arminsky. You see his name in the caption there. Mark Arminsky, he's one of the greatest concert poster designers to ever come out of the city of Detroit. There's one other guy that might be better than him. And the most fruitful era of his career is right there in the mid-90s. So there's a really good possibility, in my opinion, that he created some of his concert posters in that adaptively renovated space also. So I was really tickled to find that wrinkle in the story. I got to tour the interior in preparation for this lecture last year. Thank you to leasing agent Nathan Sellers, who showed me around the place. It's owned by a pretty prominent property owner in Detroit by the name of Dennis Kefalinos, and they presently have 172 tenants, which greatly outnumbers that top number that they were bragging of in the 60s. So Nathan tells me that renting the small space inside is relatively easy. It's the big spaces that remain vacant. So lots of small studio space here among the 172 tenants. I got to look inside a few studios. He also took me to a really large, fully empty room that gives you an idea of the dramatic steel sash curtain walls that were so common to Kahn designs of this era. Even though we're getting into the era of electricity here, daylight into the factory to maximize the working hours is still a consideration, and that's why we see so many huge windows like this in factories built during this era. This room, a group of local spray painters was allowed to take possession of it for a day or two a couple years back, Sellers tell me, and that's why we see so many graffiti inside. So, let's look at this is the larger building. All the previous pictures I showed you were in the smaller building. This is the larger building. The larger building is actually fully vacant at this point, which is kind of distressing for me, because if you stay fully vacant for too long, eventually you're getting torn down. I would love to see a reuse. This used to be the, what did they call it? Russell Bazaar, and it was a flea market there for many years, but they're not running anymore. So what kind of adaptive renovation might justify being number 2 in my lecture? To answer that question, we have to look at what's happening in the larger art world throughout the earth at that time. And what we're experiencing in the 2010s is a massive explosion of the legitimacy and public acceptance of outdoor art, murals and graffiti-style art that's originally pioneered in the Bronx and Brooklyn of New York in the 70s. And for obvious reasons, there's been a lot of resistance against graffiti over the years. In many cases, it is vandalism, but it's also the birthplace of a lot of great American artists, and that's recognition. It really starts taking hold in the 2010s, and because Detroit is a city with a lot of vacant real estate and arguably a lack of oversight, it becomes one of the world centers for graffiti and mural art production. And getting a wall in Detroit in the 2010s is among the easiest things you can do, be it an illegal or legal wall. There's a lot of legal projects happening in the city at this time. So a graffiti in and of itself, painted on a Kahn building, that's not enough to be number 2 on the list. But what is? How about a graffiti where Albert Kahn himself is the subject, which was just completely blew my mind the first time I came across this. This was painted in 2014 by a guy by the name of Kyle Danley, who lives in Grosse Pointe. And Kyle tells me that he now makes a living as a mural painter, which is a great addition to his story. This was his first mural he ever painted, he told me. And this is, to me, just an insanely amazing example of Albert Kahn's influence being so pervasive that it can reach through 2-3 generations beyond his lifetime and affect a subculture that wasn't even a glimmer in anyone's eye at the time he passed away. There is one caveat to this story, however, and this comes down to the confusion about what buildings on this site are designed by Kahn. Danley painted this mural believing it to be on a Kahn building. Turns out it's not. So we can't call it an adaptive reuse of a Kahn building, but we can call it an adaptive reuse of a building at a site dominated by Kahn structures. And I think we also have to take the artist's original intent in mind when we issue a rating. If this was on a Kahn building, I'd give it a 10, no questions asked. But since it got painted on one of the buildings right next to Kahn buildings, we're only going to give it an 8. Let's move on to the number 1 example tonight, and we're going to talk about the PACKARD plant, a famously blighted area of Detroit at Grand and Concord that many people have discussed over the years. How can we reuse it, or can we just tear it down? Well, it's getting torn down right now, and it's a lot of history down the drain, but you also have to acknowledge that time marches on, and it's probably safer for this building to be raised than to stay up in its current condition. So again, we use the Sanborn insurance maps when we go looking for the exact building dates, because this is a plant where a lot of the buildings get built as 2 stories. A couple years later, they add 2 more stories. The building we're going to look at, 27, that's exactly the case. So Sanborn maps, they can help you answer a lot of those questions, but you got to spend a lot of time learning how to read them before you really get your answers. Much like Murray, PACKARD's run in Detroit ends in the mid-50s. The plant is shut down. There's a bank auction of the interior machinery, and it lies vacant for maybe 1 or 2 years before it reemerges in '58 as PACKARD Properties. And just like the Murray, the owners of the property, they want to make it into a mixed-use development that hosts all kinds of different industries in the city. And we have a few examples here. The Detroit office of the Defense Contract Administration region, that's an office that organizes between the military and military producers, producers of military equipment. So that's like a really super important usage, but not that crazy weird. On the far right there, we have evidence of GM running impound auctions. That's a pretty interesting use. The city of Detroit, they're using it as a training facility in the late 80s. So all interesting stuff, but nothing so interesting that it would warrant being number 1 on the list. What might? Well, would you believe, folks, that this story has come full circle back to my earliest years in Detroit when I used to come here regularly to go to what we called raves and see techno and house music. And in February of 1993, exactly 30 years from today, I was dragged to my first rave by a very good friend of mine, and it ended up being at the PACKARD plant. And that night, I saw a Windsorite by the name of Richie Houghton, who is now a world-famous techno star, perform for about 4 hours. I watched a few other performers. I was there for somewhere between 6 and 8 hours, and it was a super awesome experience for me that turned into about a 2 to 3 decade love of techno music that I still have today, but I don't engage in this subculture as much as I used to. But in the 90s and 2000s, this was my thing that I loved to do. So an interesting thing about the PACKARD plant is that it's one of the top rave venues in Detroit throughout the 1990s. And it's so commonly known as a rave venue that unlike other venues in town that are sometimes illegal, they will often put their address right on the flyer. Other venues, they have you call somebody. It's called a map point. Or you go, you call to get the location before, or you go to a place called a map point where they give you the location. Because some of them aren't completely on the up and up. Packard plant maybe fall into that group. I can't speak to that. But what is interesting is that they publish the address on these, which you don't commonly see in flyers from the era. But even more interesting than the address is our 4 performers this night. We have Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunderson, Eddie Folks, and Derek May. And these guys are the absolute most important core of techno music producers in Detroit that created the sound that was exported throughout the world and arguably rivals Motown in terms of its influence at this point. But it's not just that the progenitors of the music performed here. It's the way the music was presented here. So acquiring and appropriating a blown-out industrial space and throwing a party in it, that's pioneered a few years earlier in London and Manchester when England is first exposed to American electronic dance music. So it didn't start here in Detroit, but a lot of people who really love this music, they would argue that the presentation of techno music in the live format was perfected here, and the place most specific to that perfecting is without a doubt the Packard plant. And sometimes people see pictures like this and they're like, really, Dale? Well, let me tell you, as rough as this pre-party photo looks, I had the time of my life at this place numerous times in the 1990s. This guy, Dat Duong of Grand Rapids, he was ensconced in this scene as well, and he donated this photo to my causes for my lecture. Sometimes I get to this point in the lecture and some people are like, well, that could be any factory, Dale. But it's not, and we know this by comparing the present day appearance of the factory to its appearance back then. And we can definitely see that our pillars are exactly the same here, but what's even more important are these stains on the ceiling left by the fire extinguishing equipment. And when you line up a few pictures of them, they match exactly. There's no question this is the spot where these parties took place. I can tell you myself, having attended many of them back in the day. So again, just another absolutely stunning example of Albert Kahn's influence being so pervasive that he can reach through his lifetime 2 generations, 3 generations down the road and affect a style of art and culture that is not a glimmer in someone's eyes at the time of his death. And for that reason, I give this entry a hard 10 on a scale of unintended consequences. That concludes my lecture tonight, folks. I thank you so much for your attention. I would like to remind you that I have books for sale this evening, Kahn's Detroit, as well as Corrado Parducci, A Field Guide to Detroit's Architectural Sculpture, and A Field Guide to Stained Glass in New Orleans. I believe my friend Jenny's parents, they already have a copy of that one. Yeah, she has all 3. So this is one of my best friend's wife's parents, and they have been super, super supportive of my architectural history career, so I'd like to acknowledge their presence here tonight. Okay, well, thanks so much for your attention tonight, folks. I really enjoyed it. If anybody wants to purchase a book, I brought them all with me.